We're thrilled that you're here to join us to explore the so important topic of taming bias, using wicked problem solving to make better decisions. My name is Tom Wujek, and I'll be one of your hosts.
And my name is Mario Arlt, and I will be your other host.
And together we'll be exploring tools and methods to identify, untangle, and tame cognitive bias in work and in life. And through the course of our presentation, we'll be exploring several themes. Two big questions. The first is, what is the impact of bias on work and life?
And how can we tame bias to make better decisions? How do we loosen their grip on us to make better choices, both personally and with other people working in teams? These are the important themes in our modern work today.
So let's dive in with three quick demonstrations of bias. The first is an optical illusion. So let's begin with two lines that are skewed, and we're going to add two horizontal lines colored in yellow. My question to you is, which is longer? Well, it's obvious that the top one is longer. We're all familiar with this bias. We've all seen it as kids in grade school. When we bring the two lines together, we see that they're of equal length. And the thing is, once we know they're of equal length and stretch them apart, they still look different. Bias is embedded deeply into the early parts of our nervous system. Second, cultural bias. I'm going to show you a number of photographs of people, and I'd like to ask you a single question, and that is, who do you think is most trustworthy? Is it person number 2, number 8, number 10? Well, obviously you can't make the decision because you just don't have enough information. However, and when you look at even more people, it becomes even more curious. But the point is that deep in our gut, in the recesses of our brains, we make decisions and we assess people just on the very few cues. A second bias. And the third, Mario?
Yeah, and the third one is cognitive bias, and we'll be talking about this a lot today, but let me give you one illustration. It's called the anchoring effect, and let's take the example that we are asking a group of people the following two questions. Question one, do you think there are more or less than 50 million project managers in the world? And the second question is, how many project managers are there actually in the world? Now consider we're asking a second group about the same type of question. We ask, do you think there are more or less than 10 million project managers in the world? And followed up by the same exact question. How many PMs are there in the world? What do you think the outcome of the experiment is when it comes to the second question? If you take a look, the most likely outcome of that is that the group one that's being given the 50 million question first versus the second group will come with a significantly higher estimate. And the reason for that is anchoring. As we have no real baseline for our estimate, we cling on to that number of the 50 million versus the 10 million. And you know this type of technique, of course, from other examples, crafty salespeople, politicians, television ads, etc. When somebody is selling us something for a very special price. And while we know this, still instinctively, we do clamor onto an anchor when we have little information about a topic.
Mario, what's the answer?
Well, the answer is being aware of it and adjusting for it to the best degree possible.
No, that's not what I mean. How many project managers are there in the world?
Oh, there you go. Well, it's actually, the estimated number is 16 million.
Ah, that's exactly what I thought. So bias comes in different types of forms. There's perceptual bias, there is personal bias, and there is cognitive bias. In fact, there is much, much more than that. Bias itself is a word that is loaded with many different connotations and meanings. You can see them here, from prejudice to inclination to evil and wrongdoing and distortion and much, much more. But in the context of our conversation today, we'll be exploring bias through this lens. Bias is a disproportionate weight in favor or against a thing or an idea. So where does the word actually come from? It's interesting. It comes from, of all things, bowling. A ball with bias would lean to one side just like your mind. So why is it important for us to explore this? Biases deeply affect how we perceive reality, how we think, and how we make decisions. Biases are mental shortcuts that can misdirect our thought and our actions. Biases can be found just about everywhere in our personal lives, in our professional lives, in our social lives. Taming biases is a vital part of modern skills, but taming bias is really hard. If we don't have a process, the skills, the self-awareness, and a willingness to examine how we work as teams and as individuals, and if we don't have tools to address bias, we dramatically increase our vulnerability to risk, to manipulation, and to making poor decisions. That's why it's important. And in the course of our conversation, we have 4 big goals to reach. The first is to illustrate the wickedness of bias, to demonstrate tools to identify, untangle, and to tame bias, and to equip your team to better deal with bias. And finally, maybe have a little bit of fun thinking about thinking. So what are we going to cover in our time together? We're going to explore 5 key topics. First, what is bias? Specifically, what's the anatomy of bias? Second, what are the steps that we can take to tame bias? Number 3, how do we identify the bias that is in operation? Number 4, how do we untangle or unravel the mechanism of bias? And number 5, how do we actually resolve or go through the full process of taming it? So let's begin with number 1, the anatomy of bias. Mario.
Yeah, let's get warmed up with a couple examples. And optimism bias is surely a prevalent one. I experience it really all the time. I observe it in others. I catch myself in certain situations making decisions based on optimism bias. Here's an example. In commercial projects where salespeople are selling the project to a customer, we do on occasion see very overly optimistic projections on both schedule and cost. And there are 2 main reasons for that. The first reason is, well, salespeople are notoriously optimistic, which I believe comes with the job of being in sales. And the second reason is that when you're selling the work without necessarily having to deliver it, it does affect, of course, your view on the balance between risk and rewards, your judgment, and of course, you don't suffer the immediate consequences for an overly optimistic projection since you're not the one delivering. So what is optimism bias? It is really the tendency to overestimate the probability of positive outcomes. We're inclined to operate based on, well, let's call it the principle of hope. Things will work out one way or another. And they sometimes do, but not always. And I'm sure you have been hearing these arguments in discussions, such as, I'm sure things will work out like they always do. Our consultants confirmed that things will work out. Fingers crossed. Everyone is so fired up about this project. It's going to happen. Hopefully we will. These are all common statements that illustrate our optimism bias. Ultimately, our recommendation is that you shouldn't count on it. You shouldn't count on the best case scenario to occur. That's the very simple logic behind optimism bias. And we will later on talk a little bit about how do we discover it and how do we more practically deal with it. My second example, I've done a lot of assessments where we looked at the maturity of project organizations and PMOs. In these assessments, we inquire about what the current practices are compared to agreed good practices. Before we get into the detailed discussion with a team that is actually being assessed, I always casually ask a very important question. So what do you think the outcome of the assessment will be on a 1 to 5 scale? And the answer is rather interesting. It's typically, I think we're pretty good at managing projects. Also, the same applies when you talk to inexperienced project managers who very often overestimate their knowledge and ability as project managers. They simply do not have the experience as to what good looks like and how hard the job may be. They haven't experienced failure and often lack the self-awareness. This is another reason why overconfidence leads to negative outcomes. The Dunning-Kruger effect is about overestimating your knowledge and abilities, especially when you don't know what good really means because you don't have a reference point. While the outcome is comparable to optimism bias, there's a very concrete reason for it. Overestimating abilities or knowledge in a certain field is what Dunning-Kruger is about. Here are some illustrations for the Dunning-Kruger effect that often leads to poor decisions and outcomes. 3/4 of low maturity organizations consider themselves above average maturity. That's my observation from doing a couple hundred of these. Secondly, 70 to 80% of transformation projects fail. And it's interesting because whenever you ask leaders at the onset of such a project, they're extremely confident about the success rate of such upcoming projects. And a third example, in various studies, we see 80% or even more drivers rate themselves as above average drivers, which of course is not possible, but it also explains that women in some places get better car insurance rates than men, and not necessarily because they are superior drivers, but because men cause more accidents as a result of overconfidence. So it's worthwhile to consider what you may not know, and when you're making decisions, this can be a lot more than what you think, especially in an area where you are lacking the experience, where your knowledge is limited. And perhaps one more insight on Dunning-Kruger effect. Sometimes it also works the other way around with renounced experts in their field. A senior scientist once told me, the more I learn about the human brain, the more I realize how little I actually know about it. I sometimes think I'm just scratching the surface and know close to nothing. So this is an illustration that Dunning-Kruger also can work the other way around. But in essence, the most important part to remember and the biggest advice we can give is that you're at risk to be overconfident when you don't know what you don't know. A final illustration for bias on projects. A number of years ago, our company completed 2 very large green energy infrastructure projects. Both exhibited a high degree of novelty and technical complexity. During the contracting phase for both projects, this novelty and complexity was not sufficiently considered in the estimating. Also, for some hard to predict risk factors, best case assumptions were used for planning. Lots of optimism bias, so to speak. While we did in the end deliver what our customer had expected from us and what we had promised, we faced significant delays and enormous cost overruns. And then we were invited to bid on a third project of the same kind. So now what do? Should we bid for this project? The initial thinking was, no, we cannot do this. Such projects are not profitable and they're too risky, they're not plannable, etc. And of course, the memory of the recent failure that we had just failed twice. What do we have here? A potent combination of recency and pessimism bias, right? Which almost led us to a no-bid decision. By the way, it wasn't the first time that we took on such a highly complex and technically challenging project for our customers. And we succeeded in delivering it many, many times. Just the last 2 of them did not work out. However, recency bias made us very reluctant to actually pursue. So what is recency bias then in a nutshell? It's the tendency to give greater importance to the most recent events and to really amplify what just happened. So you may want to think of some other examples in your life, how recent events or information disproportionately affected your action. These are just some examples. I'm sure you can think of a lot more. You had an accident, for example, and now you're extra careful. The last 2 people that you hired did not turn out to be a good fit for the team. You're probably going to be extra careful and a little worried about your hiring decisions. Or you watched a couple of TV stories about some dangerous new computer virus. Will it affect whether you click on a link or download a piece of software? Possibly yes. So what do we suggest? we're all prone to recency bias. And the best trick is to take a look further back and all around us, relax, and consider the bigger picture and the longer history behind. What may just have happened may not be an indicator to what will happen next.
So those are great examples, Mario, and I think we can all appreciate and relate to these and the variations that they had. Now, what's interesting about bias is that it is a cognitive phenomena, and it happens at every stage of cognition, from visual perception to the perception of people to the perception of whether a project works or not. So cognitive biases are thinking patterns that affect how we understand and how we process information, and they can distort our conclusions. And it's important to remember that cognitive biases are very much a natural part of how our brain works, and it's really how our brain is wired. When we're overwhelmed, when there's too much information, when the data has not enough meaning, when there's a lot of stress involved, our brain goes to shortcuts that can lead to judgments and error. And those of you who study this know that there are type 1 and type 2 types of shortcuts. The fast, or type 1 and type 2 type of thinking. Type 1 is the fast, easy, and snap judgments, and biases also can occur in slow, deliberate, and effortful thinking that has been characterized as type 2. The point is that our thinking just feels right when we're in the midst of the bias. It's a natural part of how our brain makes mental models of the world, how we construct an internal representation of what is true, what isn't true, what's immediate, what's long-term, what's critical, what's less important. These are not existing in reality, if you will. We build mental models, and biases are one of the methods by which we construct different biases. So, Mario, we've talked about this. How many biases have been documented?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would like the audience to think about this. Is it 18, or is it maybe 34, 89, 126, or maybe is it 200? What's your guess?
I know the answer because we've been working on this for 17 COVID years.
Yes, correct. And Tom, it's about 200 of them. And some, of course, are more common than others. And the interesting thing is, while the knowledge about these biases is out there, little of that has really trickled down into day-to-day problem solving and decision making. We're not good at navigating this sheer amount of cognitive bias, and even some of the most prevalent ones, we're not effectively getting our arms around them. So perhaps that's not good news, but no reason to give up yet. We'll give you some tips on how to spot cognitive bias and how to deal with them when you're solving problems.
You know, so bias, as we're learning, is pervasive. It touches just about every aspect of life. Seriously, you know, it's something that we find in our professional and also in our personal lives. How do we systematically tame bias? Well, that brings us to our second key theme of identifying the steps. And broadly, it's about taking 3 broad actions. First is to become aware of the potential of bias acting on the situation and on you, and naming it. This involves being curious and being willing to see if a bias is operating. That itself is a skill and a capability. Second, make the structure of the bias visible and explicit. And we do this by making our mental models and our thinking visible and becoming a subject of investigation. And as you'll see, this means literally drawing it out figuratively and literally. Third is to take some action to diffuse the power of the bias. It's having the willingness to perform a simple task to reduce the chokehold that the bias may have upon us. And as you'll see, there's a set of activities to engage people to make a shift in thinking in new ways, which is often counter to their inclination. So these are 3 big steps. Now, as many of you know, we've with PMI, I've launched a program called Wicked Problem Solving and have developed a series of what are called plays, which act as checklists for us to perform this important work. Here we've got number one, identify the plays, to become aware of the bias, to unravel it. Secondly is to see the mechanism at play, to untangle it. And third is to take action to tame the bias. So let's see how they actually play out. So number one, pose questions to become aware. Number two, create a visual representation of the situation. Number three, rethink the situation with additional perspectives. And the impact of that is the following. Questions allow us to pause and reflect and identify the potential biases that are operating. Untangling or visualizing allows us to analyze and chart the dynamics, quite literally seeing a simple systems model of the bias at play. And thirdly, to make a shift in thinking and action. So we've gone through this twice because it's really critical to unravel each of these steps, because if you miss one of them, you may potentially still have the bias operating at play. So let's go back to our first example of optimism bias. So start by asking the right questions. For the last 5 projects of this time, the actual implementation was between 6 and 8 months. What do you think you can get done in 3 months? Then untangle and actually have people visualize their thinking. We'll go into more detail into that, but it's an act of sticky noting and seeing the mental models of people's opinions. And then thirdly, to go through a process of discussion and other activities to work the bias. So do you see that? Identify, untangle, and tame. So these are really critical factors for us to have richer and deeper conversations and to elevate the quality of the conversation, not being stuck inside of the work, but having time to reflect and think about the dynamics that are operating at work. So, for example, there are different ways of working the situation. And Mario, you have some suggestions about how we can work the optimism bias.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the techniques is the devil's advocate method. And it's a very simple approach because you get someone in the room, someone from your team, somebody else, to make the opposite argument and highlight everything that could go wrong. Playing devil's advocate, as we say, is a very effective technique to poke some holes into assumptions and reveal bias. There are also some quantitative methods, depending on what it is about. So, for example, there's a technique called reference class forecasting that allow you for certain types of project where optimism bias is prevalent to use statistical data for a comparable class of projects to make more realistic estimates. But we will not cover this today. I think this would warrant a whole separate talk.
Well, the art and science of project management, right? I mean, it goes so deep, and it is so rich, so many fantastic methods that we can draw from. So identify, untangle, and tame. 3 things to keep in mind, 3 little checklist activities. So as I mentioned, these 3 steps make up a play. A play is a time-bound course of action that allows you to, well, frankly, do better work. So, so play can be visualized as a play card where each element, the question, the visualization, and the act actually is, constitutes this card. And this card is a handy way for us to think about how we best organize our work, how we can best perform different types of activities. So again, why are plays important? Well, they allow us to think freshly about knowledge work. They allow us to foster a systems model approach to understanding the world and understanding situations in the world. I think even more importantly, they allow teams to focus. They allow teams to make their thinking more vivid, so it's not just in conversation. And they allow teams to become more active, turning passive bystanders into active participants. And so plays encourage us to concentrate, to do more memorable work, and also to engage more fully. So the art and science of dealing with bias is largely about designing and running better plays. Make sense? They're kind of mental checklists that we can perform. And so if we could put a bias into a play, it would look kind of like this, an optimism bias with a question, a diagram, and some activities to help us make it visible. And the Dunning-Kruger effect and the recency effect, all of these can be turned into biases. So what we've done with PMI is to build out a set of bias cards. And these cards are physical and or digital cards that you can use to kind of check in to see if there is a bias that's operating. And so we find that these are really practical tools to add to your arsenal of project management techniques to pause, to visualize, and to take action. So again, if you're interested in this, go to wickedproblemsolver.com/bias and you can download a set of cards and you can learn more about how you can use them. We're really excited about these cards. That we think they're really great tools to do the kind of deeper thinking and the elevated work that modern knowledge work needs to encompass today. Mario.
Yeah, I think that's perfect, and yeah, I can only encourage you to play with this. Nevertheless, just be aware it's really a hard thing to do to tame bias, because we are really very much tied to our way of thinking. We suffer from confirmation bias. Our own frame of reference is what really drives us, and we are more effective at actually addressing bias when we follow a defined process. So we can identify and untangle and tame bias by selecting and running the plays that Tom showed you. And what we are doing is this. We want to ask better, more focused questions as a starting point, and making the thinking and the information visible. And as a result of that, we can engage people to perform tasks to validate their thinking.
You know, Mario, I was thinking, if someone else, another dynamic duo, put this presentation together, what would they produce? You know, two millennials, or two people living in other sides of the world, or two folks living, working in other industries. I'm sure many of the ideas would be covered, but the examples might be completely different. We too, of course, bring our own bias in. So let's move on and continue to our next step of identifying bias. And that, of course, is done through the power of questions. So let me tell you a story about the power of questions. This is a painting, one of the most famous paintings in the world. It's called The Night Watch. Many of you will recognize it as one of Rembrandt's finest. It's 14 by 17 feet in size, and it depicts the march of a militia to protect their home city of Amsterdam. And the painting itself needed protection 40 years ago because a deranged school teacher attacked the painting. And so the painting needed to be restored. The museum curators realized they needed 4 years to actually restore the painting. But they did something interesting. They asked the museum visitors what they would like to know about the painting. And they gave them cards. They gave them postcards. And the museum visitors would ask questions about the topics that they thought would be really interesting to find out about. Often questions that museum curators wouldn't want to even consider because it's kind of not on their bias. And so there were hundreds, then thousands, then, you know, where the story goes, tens of thousands of these postcards. And then the museum curators did something even more clever. They took the top 50 questions and they created a gallery just of the questions and answers. Museum visitors would come and look at this. That was the only thing that was in the gallery. And then they would look at the painting. And then they would really look at the painting. And then they did something that they weren't supposed to do. They went back into the first gallery to look at some more questions, and then went to the second gallery to look at the painting again. Museum curators, I used to work in the museum world, so I know we did all kinds of strange analytics and data. They measured how long people looked at the painting. Average time before there were questions, 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Average time afterwards, what do you think it is? 5, 7, 10 minutes. See what I'm doing? I'm anchoring you. The actual is 24 minutes and 40 seconds. That's 10 times longer. So nothing actually changed about the painting. I mean, ostensibly it's still the same painting because it's just repaired. But what changed was the mindset, because the visitors had an inquisitive mindset, one born of curiosity and exploration. They looked more deeply into the painting and they kind of had a deeper conversation with it. Really interesting, isn't it? That's part of the power of questions. And deep questions can enrich and deepen our mental models. They can also collapse them too, depending on the kind of questions that we ask. So it's really critical, we think, to figure out a taxonomy of questions that will help explore, to help us, again, elevate our thinking and to enrich our mental models, as opposed to, what's the word, fossilize them or crystallize them. In our modern world, we need better ways to make sense of the changes. These models are invisible. You can't see the mental models that are inside of my brain, nor can I see yours. And as we mentioned before, they feel correct. Of course, I know that insert name of newspaper that I always like to read is the full truth, and the newspaper that other guy likes to read, not so much. So all of that is shaped by bias. We've got some fun examples to explore bias more fully.
Yeah, and one example for bias that we want to play with is this symmetry puzzle. And our question is for you, what is the easiest way, the simplest way to make this design, as it is here, symmetrical from left to right and top to bottom? Think about it for a second. What is your solution?
I know. Oh.
All right, Tom, so let's take a look. I wonder how many of you came with the following solution. But it's not the only one, and it's surely not the simplest one. So, for example, how about instead of adding something, removing something? That is a much simpler solution, but it is interesting that in most cases, when confronted with a solution to a puzzle like this, people have a tendency to add rather than to subtract, even if the solution is actually easier. And this isn't all. There are many other solutions.
And it's really interesting, isn't it? So that itself is a bias. It's a bias towards a mental strategy. Here's another one. And I'm sure many of you have seen this. It's called the 9-dot problem. It's a classic puzzler. And the task is really simple. Draw 9 dots and then connect them with 4 straight lines without lifting your pen off the paper. And if you try doing it, you start off and you do the second line, a third line, and then a fourth line. Oh no, and you can't do it. In fact, it's actually impossible to do if you're constrained by thinking inside of the box. And so the bias here, you can see it, is that there is an invisible box, a perceptual and cognitive boundary that prevents us from finding a solution. It's as if there's a fence around the box, and with that fence there's no possible solution. But once you realize there is no fence, the solutions become obvious, and you just simply draw outside and find the solution. Solution made. Or is it? Is there another way as well? So we often stop at the first correct solution or the first workable solution. Big problem when we foster innovation. Sometimes there are better solutions that happen when we reframe this. So this term of thinking outside of the box was coined in 1967 by a management consultant and used this puzzle to illustrate it. In fact, there are some other puzzles as well. So if you allow even more space, you can connect them with not 4, but with 3 lines. The dots are big and the lines are thick. Or if you take your piece of paper and you roll it into a tube, you actually only need 1 line. It just goes all the way around. A little bit of topological magic. Or you can rip up the paper. No one says you couldn't rip up the paper, and you just take the 9 dots and you stab a hole all the way through it. You don't even need to draw a single line. So questions are tools that allow us to reframe situations.
So, what are the question types? Clarify statement. Secondly, to probe assumptions in order to find out what drives the thinking of the other person. The reason and evidence. Is there logic behind it? Is there reasoning behind it? Is the argument footed in good, solid evidence? You really do want to inquire about the viewpoint because it reveals what may be the drivers, the anxieties, the concerns of the other person. Probe for implications and consequences speaks for itself. And as I said already, search for motive if you're being asked a question to understand the other party. This is a very effective technique, and we give you another illustration here out of the project management context. So another technique is about how do I line up my questions in an inquiry. So experienced people, they know what to ask, and most importantly, they know how to ask the question. So let's talk about the how part a little bit. And you obviously know people very often ask suggestive questions. And suggestive questions always are more or less to confirm your own thinking. You may ask, did you dispatch an inspector immediately? Did you reconfirm the plans with engineering? Didn't you? These are suggestive questions. You already have the answer in mind and you're seeking confirmation. And we instinctively do so for our own thinking because we want to see if somebody acted the same way we did. Instead, there's a better technique where you really get to the bottom of it. And this is what you see here. It's called funneling. You open up, you ask a question about to get the context, to find out what may have actually happened. Secondly, you dig deeper and you may ask questions about the what and the how. And lastly, you probe further to really get to the root and get a solid understanding of what is the driver, the motivation, and then the bias context. What's the origin of the bias? Make sense?
It makes sense, and it's so simple to add this structure to guide people, to help them navigate through the process of getting clarity. It's a very powerful tool. So identifying questions is a critical skill in addressing. So the bias cards that you can download have really lead with questions. But more than that, it's not just rote. It's making that little shift inside of us to go from, insert question to, I really wonder if this is at play, to create that mental space inside of us so that we really listen to the answer, right? So question asking can be a drill, but can it also be opening up into space? So be mindful about what purpose it has. So our recommendation is to add bias plays to improve your work. For example, if you're making a decision to hire from 4 people, you might start off by these plays of identifying the goal, clarifying the goal, identifying the options. Third, defining the criteria. What does success look like? From there, weigh the options. So which person do you want to hire against the skills that you are hiring for? Create a little visual grid to make that happen. And then you make a decision. So, based on the highest ranking, you choose person A. And voila, you have a decision. Now, as you go through these steps, in fact, something might be missing, and that is, if you go deeper, you may need to introduce other plays to go a little further. There are simulation trees, and of course, there are biases. So in this set of plays, you may introduce an identify bias, and then within that, you can pick a bias that might be in operation. So for example, in a hiring decision, there might be a confirmation bias, which is hiring the person that looks and sounds and acts like you. Or an in-group bias, which is group think, all of us thinking in the same way because we're all kind of cut from the same cloth. Or a recency bias, we hired someone like that and decided to hire or not hire because of our previous experiences. So these allow us to reflect on and add more richness to our conversation, expand the points of view so we make a better decision in the end. Without these plays, we can mechanically follow the checklist without having the time to reflect on our own thinking. Again, that's part of the bias. So we've produced a good collection of 24 biases. I know it's only less than, or it's about 10% of the full amount, just a little bit more. But these are the most common biases that we can experience with instructions of the kinds of questions, the ways of visualizing, and so on. So it's a great kind of starting kit. Okay, so that's identifying bias. So identifying bias is what? It's about asking the right questions to create the space to allow you to think about if something else is going on, if there's some unconscious mechanism that's steering or distorting, moving the ball in a certain way. Let's move over to the next section, which is untangling bias. So let's do a quick design exercise. And this is a way for us to think about the power of visual thinking. I'm going to ask you, well, imagine that you're in a foreign land and you need to order some breakfast and you'd like some toast, but the waiter doesn't speak any English and has no idea what you're talking about. I've actually met two people who've actually never made toast in their life. It's absolutely true. And so you take out a pen and paper and using no words whatsoever, draw a picture of how to make what you want for breakfast, crispy, darkened bread, toast. So what would you draw? So I've actually done this design exercise many times, and believe it or not, I have about 15,000, absolutely true, 15,000 drawings. And it teaches us the power of thinking in systems, or more importantly, the act of transferring our mental models into visual models and the power that they have to expose our way of thinking and bias. Here's where it gets really interesting. Most North Americans draw a picture of making toast using a toaster, of course, because that's how you make toast. But if you did the exercise in Northern Europe, in Denmark in particular, you'd get a lot of drawings that look like this, because that's how you make toast. And if you do it in business schools, you would get pictures that look like this. Absolutely true. I have no idea why a lot of business school students love to make. It's absolutely true. It's like 50% of them make toast like this. And I think it must do with the cost of tuition. I don't know, some kind of bias. But there are other biases as well. So recently I did a workshop with a group of energy company executives. And I want you to take a look at if you see anything common about what they drew. So about 60% of them drew pictures of the toaster connected with a power connection, without realizing it until I actually pointed it out to them. Again, bias. And recently I got an email from a systems biologist in the Philippines, and she said, no, you're all wrong. Here's the proper way to make toast. Start with the wheat, gets put into grains, into bread that gets toasted, into waste, which then gets returned to the wheat fields. So her mental model, her bias, is that everything works in loops and in cycles. Not a bad model for how systems actually work. So the point is that we all have gone to whiteboards and sticky noting, and we know how to make ideas visible by simply talking them through. But there's an art and science of making that better, both physically and virtually. So there's a great collection of new tools, including Miro and Mural, which are digital whiteboarding tools that allow us to perform this visualization in person, but virtually. So it's a really powerful tool. And what we can do is visualize products. We can visualize strategy. We can visualize innovation, and we can visualize principles. And we can visualize bias. The simple act of collaboratively working together and creating a simple picture changes the conversation because it offloads the cognitive cost of keeping everything in your head to a shared visual surface. And once we see this, we are freer to think about other aspects. The bias has less of a stranglehold upon us because we have got it out of our head, and then we can think about what's actually operating here. So the power is really tremendous, and it's really simple. So with optimism and pessimism bias, you might do something super simple. So if there's a particular project at play, you can ask people, how do you feel about it? And you draw a line across, and you label it from optimistic to pessimistic, 1 to 10, whatever it may happen to be, and then you ask people to sticky note the responses. You will get a visual snapshot that reflects the collective mental models, and then allow yourself to think, oh, so why are we more pessimistic than optimistic? Or it might look something like this. So whatever type of visualization you get useful information, and then you can explore and to debate it. So consider this one here. You have the most people are being optimistic, and there is one person who is pessimistic. Mario, what would you make of this? Is it just the lone wolf? Is it just an idiot? Or is it something else?
Well, we probably don't know without context, but it's interesting what reactions this causes, right? This could be either very uncomfortable because he's the proverbial rock in the shoe, or it could actually be very insightful because someone has a different, a divergent opinion that very well may be worthwhile listening to. So I think it's always important to consider the opportunity, and then with the tools that we talked about earlier, the inquiry, the questioning, to get to the bottom of this viewpoint that may actually shed some light on something that the others haven't seen.
Yeah, brilliantly said. You don't know until you go through the process, but without surfacing it, without allowing that dissenting voice, or without, in some cases, it might be an introvert who is kind of unwilling, so it would just pass. But instead, by making it visible, the group shifts their attention from looking at each other and debating to shifting their attention to the shared visual surface, where they can, like a scientist, analyze what's going on and create a better picture moving forward. So that, again, is part of the power of making ideas visible, making bias visible. And of course, through the cards, you can find out there are more richer, more involved methods with 2x2 matrices. In fact, there's a whole world of this. In fact, there are several dozen different types of simple visualizations, and you're familiar with all of them. And they range from something as simple as a line or an arrow or a squiggle and so on. Each particular illustration or form has a particular topology or structure that can reflect the nature of the situation that you're reflecting. So in some cases you want to use a map, in other cases you want to visualize a person or their emotion, or create a systems model with stocks and flows. Whatever it may happen to be, this too is part of your arsenal to help think more broadly and to interrogate the situation in fresh ways. So there's a whole visual language that we think is really critically important to be able to visualize. We make it easy and fun for you to actually insert the diagrams inside of the cards. So framing effect has a particular set, and every card has its own. So again, it's a distillation of these principles of figuring out what are the questions and what are the diagrams and what are the actions. By the way, one of them, the most powerful, is something called a mind dump, where you simply get people to put their ideas onto the shared surface physically or digitally and allow them to see what everyone is thinking and then cluster and move them. Again, we're familiar with these design thinking and lean techniques. Just one other thing, if you're interested in this, Wicked Problem Solving is a tool that allows you to really understand the nature of these plays much more deeply. Let's move to our final section, Taming Bias. I'd like to show you a video that really captures the grip that biases have on us.
I'm going to give you guys three numbers, a three-number sequence, and I have a rule in mind that these three numbers obey. And I want you to try to figure out what that rule is. But the way that you can get information is by proposing your own set of three numbers, to which I will say, yes, that follows my rule, or no, it doesn't follow my rule, and then you can propose what you think the rule is. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so here are the three numbers. 2, 4, 8.
2, 4, 8.
You don't need to continue the sequence, you can propose a totally different sequence, whatever you want to propose, and I will simply say yes or no, that follows my rule.
2, 4, 8. 16, 32.
16, 32, and
64.
Those also follow my rule.
Okay.
What's the rule? What are you thinking?
Multiply by 2.
That is not my rule.
What?
That's not my rule. But you're allowed, if you want, propose three other numbers.
3, 6, 12.
3, 6, 12.
3, 6, 12 follows my rule.
10, 20, 40.
10, 20, 40.
That follows the rule.
Yeah, I'm still multiplying by 2.
I know. I know what you're doing. And yes, it follows my rule, but no, it's not my rule.
5, 10,
10 and 20.
Follows my rule.
100,
200, 400.
Follows my rule.
500, 1,000, 2,000.
Follows my rule.
Want me to keep going?
But do I just keep going? You're going to tell me your rule?
Am I doing it the wrong way? Am I approaching this the wrong way?
You're totally fine,
Okay.
but you're approaching it the way most people approach it. Like, think strategically about this. You want information.
Yeah.
I have information. The point of the three numbers, right, is to allow you to figure out what the rule is.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to give you the numbers that I don't think fits the sequence and then see what you say. So I'll say 2, 4, 7.
Fits my rule.
So whatever I propose is right?
So is your rule like you can propose any number?
So the rule is anything we say is yes.
No.
So that's really remarkable, isn't it? We have this mental model of what the rule is, and the rule itself is any ascending number, but it's our tendency to want to prove the rule as opposed to what a scientist would do, which is to find evidence to disprove the rule. That's the mechanism to determine what the rule actually is. Once you have a rule in mind, we have a tendency to confirm it. So we have the set of rules of 2, 4, and then the mind just wants to go.
Well, our mind wants to go higher, of course. And only, as you said, only if we're trying to break the rule, will we find out what the rule is. So if I were to say 2 or 8, I would break the rule. And if I were now to randomly assemble other numbers going up, I will actually figure out what the rule obviously is.
Yeah, it's so powerful. Can you feel that it feels right to put in a 32 there? Obviously, because our brains have these pattern making, they're pattern making machines. And once we have a pattern in place, that cognitive bias, it closes us off to other options. Really a powerful evolutionary mechanism that has served us well for generations and for millennia, but now in a world of lots of chaos and change, not so much. We need the skills to be able to go, maybe not so much, because we can be led down the wrong pathway. So it's really critical for us to adopt the mindset of a scientist. So when I use the word scientist, what picture do most of us put in? I usually put in Albert Einstein, but I really should put Maria Sklodowska, also known as Marie Curie, the co-discoverer of radium and Nobel Prize winner. Amazing. Adopt the mindset of a scientist to think more clearly. Seek out data that disproves the rule, not proves the rule, and that's a really hard thing to do. So what's really at play here? Essentially, what we need to do as leaders in the knowledge economy is to create an architecture of willingness, a willingness to question, a willingness to make bias visible, and a willingness to make a shift in thinking and in your approach, even a shift in feeling and in behavior. And these are really critical skills for us. The bias cards are just a great tool, great reminder, kind of a checklist to do that, but it's really the internal shift and the willingness to make that space available, which is really quite critical. So why aren't we willing? You know, Mario and I have talked about this quite a bit, and we boiled it down to 3 things. First, being right is stronger than facts. Second, identity is stronger than facts. And third, belonging is stronger than facts. But is this the right order, Mario?
Well, I think the order varies for everyone a little bit, doesn't it? And for some people it is being right is most important. And for many of us, identity is really the critical one. But it doesn't change the fact that there are inhibitors for us to have the willingness to think different, to change, and being aware of that is the first step to actually address it.
Absolutely. So this is part of the difficult but oh so important and work that I think elevates a really good project manager from a fantastic project manager. This willingness to explore different points of view, not only in others, but especially in yourself. Build those skills, and I think you'll prepare yourself for the further turbulence that we have ahead in our decades to come. We'll be willing to make a shift. So we're really excited with PMI to launch Wicked Problem Solving. We explore these topics through a set of videos that bring to life the challenges that project managers face and quite literally visualize them and show how we can design and run better plays. We guide folks through a collection of different exercises with digital tools so that you can actually do these bias and mind map plays and many others. There's a series of reference books that you can use to deepen your knowledge and your understanding of the different principles that underpin creative collaboration and deep knowledge work. And a set of playbooks that allow you to design and run your own plays, from the simple and concise plays to the difficult and wicked plays. There's a set of cards that include ways to ask better questions, to make ideas visible, to think about those forward steps, and as well as the kinds of plays. And I think what's great is that there's now software for us to collaborate remotely, and it's as if we're in the same room together running these plays together. So I'm really excited about this program. We've worked long and hard to really craft it and to create the best possible product to help us collectively elevate our skills so that we do better and deeper work. So there we have it, our conversation in 5 big chunks: bias, steps, identify, untangle, and tame. So to really come to grips with bias in our personal and everyday life, those that pervade our world, we need to take these 3 steps: identify, untangle, and tame. The better we become at this, the more effective we will be as knowledge workers. So what are your next steps forward? Be on the lookout for bias. Sniff out the feeling of certainty or uncertainty and unwillingness to examine. That's a clue to run a bias play.
And then run plays to address bias, become adept to questioning, make the ideas visible, and performing and instructing tasks.
And finally, access modern tools. Visit wickedproblemsolver.com/bias and download a set of bias cards. We hope that as you do this, your skills and your capabilities as being a wicked problem solver improve. Thanks so much for your time, and bye for now.